Chapter 2, Mr. Teddy Henfrey's First Impressions. At 4 o'clock, when it was fairly dark and Mrs. Hall was screwing up her courage to go in and ask her visitor if he would take some tea, Teddy Henfrey, the clock jobber, came into the bar. "My sakes, Mrs. Hall," said he, "but this is terrible weather for thin boots." The snow outside was falling faster. Mrs. Hall agreed, and then noticed he had his bag with him. "Now you're here, Mr. Teddy," said she, "I'd be glad if you'd give th old clock in the parlor a bit of a look. 'Tis going, and it strikes well and hearty, but the hour hand won't do nothin' but point at 6. And leading the way, she went across to the parlor door, rapped, and entered. Her visitor, she saw as she opened the door, was seated in the armchair before the fire, dozing, it would seem, with his bandaged head drooping on one side. The only light in the room was the red glow from the fire, which lit his eyes like adverse railway signals but left his downcast face in darkness, and the scanty vestiges of the day that came in through the open door. Everything was ruddy, shadowy, and indistinct to her, the more so since she had just been lighting the bar lamp, and her eyes were dazzled. But for a second it seemed to her that the man she looked at had an enormous mouth wide open, a vast and incredible mouth that swallowed the whole of the lower portion of his face. It was the sensation of a moment, the white-bound head, the monstrous goggle eyes, and this huge yawn below it. Then he started up in his chair, and put up his hand. She opened the door wide so that the room was lighter, and she saw him more clearly, with the muffler held up to his face just as she had seen him hold the serviette before. The shadows, she fancied, had tricked her. "Would you mind, sir, this man coming to look at the clock, sir?" she said, recovering from the momentary shock. "Look at the clock," he said, staring round in a drowsy manner and speaking over his hand. Then, getting more fully awake, he added, "Certainly." Mrs. Hall went away to get a lamp, and he rose and stretched himself. Then came the light, and Mr. Teddy Henfrey, entering, was confronted by this bandaged person. He was, he says, taken aback. "Good afternoon," said the stranger, regarding him as Mr. Henfrey says, with a vivid sense of the dark spectacles, like a lobster. "I hope," said Mr. Henfrey, "that it's no intrusion." "None whatever," said the stranger. "Though, I understand," he added, turning to Mrs. Hall, "that this room is really to be mine for my own private use." "I thought, sir," said Mrs. Hall, "you'd prefer the clock." "Certainly," said the stranger. "Certainly. But, as a rule, I like to be alone and undisturbed. But I'm really glad to have the clock seen to," he said, noticing a certain hesitation in Mr. Henfrey's manner. "Very glad." Mr. Henfrey had intended to apologize and withdraw, but this anticipation reassured him. The stranger turned round with his back to the fireplace and put his hands behind his back. "And presently," he said, "when the clock mending is over, I think I should like to have some tea." "But not till the clock mending is over." Mrs. Hall was about to leave the room. She made no conversational advances this time, because she did not want to be snubbed in front of Mr. Henfrey when her visitor asked her if she had made any arrangements about his boxes at Bramblehurst. She told him she had mentioned the matter to the postman, and that the carrier could bring them over on the morrow. "You are certain that is the earliest," he said. She was certain, with a marked coldness. "I should explain," he added, "what I was really too cold and fatigued to do before, that I am an experimental investigator." "Indeed, sir," said Mrs. Hall, much impressed. "And my baggage contains apparatus and appliances." "Very useful things indeed they are, sir," said Mrs. Hall. "And I am very naturally anxious to get on with my inquiries." "Of course, sir." My reason for coming to Iping, he proceeded, speaking with a certain deliberation, was a desire for solitude. I do not wish to be disturbed in my work. In addition to my work, an accident. I thought as much, said Mrs. Hall to herself. Necessitates a certain retirement. My eyes are sometimes so weak and painful that I have to shut myself up in the dark for hours together. Lock myself up. Sometimes, now and then. Not at present, certainly. At such times, the slightest disturbance, the entry of a stranger into the room, is a source of excruciating annoyance to me. It is well these things should be understood. Certainly, sir, said Mrs. Hall. And if I might make so bold as to ask. That, I think, is all, said the stranger, with that quietly irresistible air of finality he could assume at will. Mrs. Hall reserved her question and sympathy for a better occasion. After Mrs. Hall had left the room, he remained standing in front of the fire, glaring, so Mr. Henfry puts it, at the clock mending. Mr. Henfry not only took off the hands of the clock in the face, but also extracted the works. He tried to work as slowly, quietly, and unobtrusively as possible. He worked with the lamp close beside him, the green shade casting a brilliant light upon his hands and upon the frame and wheels, while leaving the rest of the room in shadow. When he looked up, colored patches swam before his eyes. Being naturally curious, he had removed the works, a quite unnecessary step, with the idea of prolonging his stay and perhaps starting a conversation with the stranger. But the stranger stood there, perfectly silent and still. So still, in fact, that it began to get on Henfrey's nerves. He felt utterly alone in the room and glanced up, and there, grey and dim, was the bandaged head and the huge blue lenses staring fixedly at him, with a mist of green spots drifting before them. It was so uncanny to Henfry that for a minute the two of them simply stared blankly at each other. Then Henfry looked down again. It was a very uncomfortable position, one in which a man would naturally want to say something. Perhaps he should remark that the weather was unusually cold for that time of year. He lifted his eyes again, as if preparing to fire off that harmless opening line. The weather, he began. Why don't you finish and go, said the rigid figure, clearly in a state of painfully suppressed rage. All you have to do is fix the hour hand on its axle. You're simply wasting time. Certainly, sir, just one more minute. I overlooked. And Mr. Henfry finished his work and left. But he left feeling thoroughly irritated. Damn it, muttered Mr. Henfry to himself as he trudged down the village road through the thawing snow. A man must repair a clock from time to time, surely. And again, can't a man even look at you? Ugly. And yet again, apparently not. If the police were after you, you couldn't be more wrapped and bandaged. At Gleason's Corner, he saw Hall, the man who had recently married the stranger's hostess at the Coach and Horses, and who now drove the Iping carriage whenever someone needed to go to Sidderbridge Junction, coming toward him on his way back from that place. Hall had clearly been stopping a bit at Sidderbridge, judging by the unsteady way he handled the reins. "How do, Teddy," he said as he passed. "You've got a strange one up at home." Teddy replied. Hall, curious and sociable, pulled up his carriage. "What's that?" he asked. "A queer-looking fellow staying at the Coach and Horses," said Teddy. "My sakes!" Then he proceeded to give Hall a vivid description of the grotesque guest. "Looks a bit like a disguise, doesn't it? I'd want to see a man's face if he were staying at my place," said Henfry. "But women are so trusting, especially when it comes to strangers." He's taken your rooms, and he hasn't even given a name, Hall. You don't say so, said Hall, who was slow to grasp things. Yes, said Teddy. By the week, too. Whatever he is, you can't get rid of him before the week is up. And he says he's got a lot of luggage coming tomorrow. Let's hope it won't be boxes full of stones, Hall. He told Hall how his aunt in Hastings had once been swindled by a stranger carrying empty portmanteaus. Altogether, the conversation left Hall feeling vaguely suspicious. Get up, old girl, Hall said to his horse. I suppose I ought to look into this. Teddy continued on his way, his mind considerably eased. However, instead of looking into it, Hall was sharply scolded by his wife for the amount of time he had spent in Sidderbridge, and his mild questions were answered with irritation and without anything relevant. But despite her dismissive tone, the seed of suspicion Teddy had planted continued to grow in Mr. Hall's mind. You women don't know everything, Mr. Hall muttered, determined to learn more about the personality of their mysterious guest at the earliest opportunity. And after the stranger had gone to bed, something he did at about 9:30, Mr. Hall marched rather aggressively into the parlor and stared intently at his wife's furniture, as if to make it clear that the stranger was not master of the house. Then he examined closely, and with a hint of contempt, a sheet of mathematical calculations the stranger had left behind. When he retired for the night, he instructed Mrs. Hall to examine the stranger's luggage very carefully when it arrived the next day. You mind your own business, Hall, said Mrs. Hall, and I'll mind mine. She was all the more inclined to snap at him because the stranger was, without question, an unusually strange sort of visitor, and she herself was far from certain about him. In the middle of the night, she woke from a dream of enormous white heads, like turnips, dragging themselves after her on endlessly long necks, with huge black eyes staring. But being a sensible woman, she calmed her fears, turned over, and went back to sleep.